After the end of World War I, the European continent was redrawn, with many small countries formed from the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire and Russia. The four major victorious countries, Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, held a peace conference in Versailles and Washington to divide the power in the world. These winning countries gained significant economic power and established trade relations with the losing countries. At the same time, conflicts arose between these countries over power, which made the newly established peace fragile. In October 1929, the economic crisis broke out in the United States and spread to the rest of the world. The crisis lasted nearly 4 years, wreaking havoc on the economies of many nations, causing serious social and political consequences. Tens of millions of unemployed workers, farmers lost their land, and many lived in poverty, experiencing famine. Protests and marches by the unemployed took place across the country. To address the situation, the four countries had to reconsider their development paths. While Britain, France, and the United States implemented social and economic reforms to overcome the consequences of the crisis, Germany, Italy, and Japan sought solutions by establishing fascist authoritarian regimes, focusing on territorial expansion, resource plundering for raw materials, and finding markets, while maintaining the crisis within their borders. The relationship between these powers became increasingly complex, leading to the formation of two opposing military blocs. On one side were Britain, France, and the United States, and on the other side were Germany, Italy, and Japan. The arms race intensified, signaling the danger of a new war. In Germany, Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party came to power, spreading propaganda, activating communism as a subordinate ideology, and establishing a fascist regime. After the fall of the Weimar Republic, Hitler's government strengthened preparations for war, amassing 1.5 million troops, 30,000 tanks, and 4,000 planes, turning Germany into a military giant, ready for invasion. Due to their shared goal of invasion and world domination, Italy, Japan, and Germany formed the Fascist Alliance. In this context, Lenin saw fascist ideology as a dangerous enemy and thus allied with the British and French capitalists to fight against fascism and the risk of war. The British and French governments shared the same objective, preserving the world order for themselves. They feared the expansion of fascism, but also wanted to defend communism. However, under their rule, they did not closely ally with the Soviet Union. On the contrary, they followed a policy of appeasement towards fascism. In response to such a situation, the United Nations was ready to help Germany counter invasion if Western countries acted together. However, the UK continued its policy of compromise, asking the German government to back down. On September 29, 1938, the Munich Conference was convened, with the leaders of the British government participating. A pact was signed, and Britain sought to create a new Soviet republic in France, demonstrating Hitler's commitment to ending all nationalism in Europe. After occupying Czechoslovakia, Hitler nationalized all nations by February 1939. Not stopping there, Hitler provoked further aggression and began preparing to wage war with Poland. Before the war began, Germany sought to negotiate with the Soviet Union to avoid a two-front war with France in the west and the Soviet Union in the east. The Soviet Union supported negotiations with Germany, seeing it as an opportunity to strengthen its forces in preparation for a potential war. The Non-Aggression Pact between Germany and the Soviet Union was signed on August 23, 1939. On the morning of September 1, 1939, the German army invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, marking the start of World War II. With its overwhelming military strength, Germany easily breached Poland's defenses in several areas, causing confusion in the Polish army as they struggled to cope with the rapid and brutal German attacks. To the east, on September 17, 1939, the Soviet Union also invaded Poland as the Polish border had been abandoned, with Polish forces focused on the Western Front fighting against Germany. The invasion by the two powers left Poland unable to defend itself, and by October 6th, the French army, with 110 battalions on the western border of Germany, had not launched any attacks or taken military action to support Poland. Following the Polish campaign, the Soviet Union began moving troops into countries near the Baltic Sea to strengthen its western border in preparation for war with Germany. In the three Baltic countries, the Soviet army met little resistance. Finland, despite fierce resistance, was eventually defeated in March 1940. Meanwhile, Germany and Western Europe experienced a period of uneasy peace, with both sides in conflict but unwilling to take decisive action. This silence ended when Germany launched an invasion of Denmark and Norway to protect the shipping routes from the seas to Germany. Denmark quickly surrendered to Germany after just a few hours of fighting. In Norway, however, the German army faced much tougher resistance, and it took 2 months for Germany to completely occupy this neutral country. After annexing the northern European countries, Hitler launched a campaign to attack France. The first phase involved a plan to invade the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg. These 3 countries were quickly attacked, and Germany won the battles. The French army, with 3.3 million troops concentrated on the Maginot Line, relied on its solid defense system to stop the German army there. However, the German army used armored forces to bypass the Maginot Line. The French forces were concentrated on the line, leaving the German army free to advance into France with little resistance. The French counterattacks to halt the German advance failed quickly. Within a month, the French government announced its surrender, while British forces were forced to retreat back to the UK. Germany occupied 3/4 of France, including Paris, the capital. In the southern part of France, the newly appointed prime minister, holding autocratic power, cooperated with Germany. After the fall of France, Britain stood alone against Germany. Germany launched 2 attacks on Britain. The first was a naval battle in the Atlantic Ocean, where German submarines targeted British cargo ships. The second was an air battle over the UK, in which both sides suffered heavy losses. Ultimately, the German Air Force had to end its campaign against the British Royal Air Force due to the bravery of the British people. On the seas, Germany's submarine fleet sank thousands of British cargo ships, severely limiting the import of goods to Britain, but this was not enough to force Britain to surrender. Germany's efforts to get Britain out of the war were unsuccessful. In September 1940, in order to strengthen the fascist alliance, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. This pact stipulated that if any of the 3 countries were attacked, the other 2 would immediately provide assistance. The agreement also outlined the division of the world, with Germany and Italy in Europe and Japan in Southeast Asia. Starting in October 1940, Hitler focused on the countries of Eastern and Southern Europe. Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria came under German control, and the German army occupied these countries by force. By the summer of 1941, the fascist powers had dominated most of Europe. Germany's fascists had prepared all necessary conditions to attack the Soviet Union. From February 1941, Hitler adopted a plan to attack the Soviet Union with a rapid war strategy, leveraging advanced military technology and surprise tactics. On June 22, 1941, Germany broke the non-aggression pact and invaded the Soviet Union. 3 German armies, totaling 5.5 million soldiers, attacked along the western border of the Soviet Union. In the first months of the war, the German army advanced deep into Soviet territory, with the Northern Army surrounding Leningrad, the Central Army moving toward Moscow, and the Southern Army taking Kiev and much of Ukraine. Unlike in France, the Red Army, although surrounded, fought back with determination, inflicting heavy losses on the German forces. In October 1941, the German command concentrated all its forces for an attack on Moscow, hoping to capture the capital and end the Soviet Union, believing that the Soviet government would flee like Poland, France, and other nations had. However, the Soviet Defense Council, led by General Stalin, remained in Moscow and directly led the defense of the capital. After 2 intense and bloody battles in October and November 1941, the German army failed to capture Moscow, suffering severe losses. By December, with the arrival of winter, the German army's combat effectiveness diminished, while the Soviet army, better trained in winter warfare, pushed the Germans out of the capital. The victory at Moscow destroyed Hitler's war strategy. After their defeat in Moscow, the Germans shifted their focus south, aiming to capture the Soviet Union's most crucial food and oil reserves. The primary goal became Stalingrad, a key city in the Soviet Union's defense. The battle for Stalingrad lasted more than 2 months, but the German army was unable to capture the city. Meanwhile, in Baku, the Italian army began its campaign in Egypt in September 1940. The battle was intense, with the Italian army facing partial defeat at the hands of the British forces. By October 1942, the British army emerged victorious, gaining the upper hand in Baku and preparing to counterattack across the front. While the war in Europe was intensifying, Japan had been preparing to enter the conflict. As early as the 1930s, Japan had invaded China, starting with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931. With superior air force and naval power, as well as highly disciplined military forces, Japan quickly occupied most of eastern China. In September 1940, Japan expanded its influence into the East Sea, prompting strong opposition from the United States. Relations between Japan and the United States grew increasingly tense, eventually leading Japan to declare war on the U.S. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, the largest U.S. naval base in the Pacific Ocean, severely damaging the U.S. fleet. The United States declared war on Japan and subsequently on Germany and Italy, spreading the conflict across the globe. After the victory at Pearl Harbor, Japan continued its military campaigns, attacking countries in Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Prosody rate from December 1941 to June 1942, the Japanese army defeated Western colonial powers, occupying a vast territory that included Thailand, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, the Philippines, Burma, Indonesia, and numerous Pacific islands. By 1942, Japan controlled approximately 8 million square kilometers of land with a population of 500 million people in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. The invasions by the Axis powers pushed countries around the world to form an anti-fascist alliance. The Soviet Union's involvement in the war shifted the political and military framework, and the British government was eventually forced to change its stance. Britain joined forces with the Soviet Union in the anti-fascist war, leading to the formation of the Anti-Fascist Alliance. On January 1, 1942, in Washington, 26 countries led by three major powers, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, issued a statement known as the United Nations Declaration. The countries involved in the declaration pledged to fight against fascism with all their forces. In response to the German War, the Soviet Army's counterattack at Stalingrad from November 1942 to February 1943 marked the turning point of World War II. In this battle, the Red Army attacked, surrounded, divided, and annihilated the German elite forces, capturing 33,000 German soldiers. Following this victory, the Red Army swiftly broke through the German counterattack at the Battle of Kursk, destroying 30 enemy divisions and forcing 50,000 German troops to retreat from the battlefield. On the Northern Front, in January and February 1944, after 900 days of intense combat with the German army, Soviet forces in Leningrad broke the siege, ending the longest encirclement campaign in the history of warfare. The Soviet Union's forces continued their offensive until June 1944, when Soviet territory was completely liberated, opening the way into Eastern Europe. On the Western Front, British and American forces coordinated their efforts to counterattack, pushing the combined Italian-German forces out of the Chalky region. In July 1943, the Allies landed on the island of Sicily in Italy. The attack on Sicily was successful, leading to the collapse of Mussolini's regime. The new Italian government signed an armistice with the Allies. However, the German forces intervened, preventing the Allies from occupying all of Italy. On September 12, 1943, Mussolini was rescued by German forces and re-established a fascist government. The German army held off Allied advances in Italy's mountainous regions until the end of the war. In June 1942, a major battle took place between U.S. and Japanese air forces. This battle resulted in a decisive defeat for Japan. In this confrontation, Japan not only lost several aircraft carriers, but also many of its best-trained Marines. The Battle of Midway is considered a turning point in the Pacific War. From August 1942 to January 1943, the U.S. military launched a series of attacks, defeating Japanese forces in the Battle of Guadalcanal. Following this victory, the U.S. began counterattacking and repeatedly fought for control of islands across the Pacific. By early 1944, the combined efforts of the Red Army and Soviet forces led to large-scale offensives on all fronts, sweeping away German forces from their occupied territories. The Soviet Union continued its advance into Eastern Europe. The victorious Soviet offensive brought the Red Army closer to the German border. In the summer of 1944, the United States, Britain, and their allies opened the Second Front in Western Europe by landing on the coast of Normandy, northern France. The battle was fierce, and although the German army was strong, it eventually ran out of resources and had to retreat from France. France was liberated, and the Allies continued their advance to liberate Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, preparing to launch an attack on Germany. Before the final defeat of Germany, the leaders of the three Allied countries, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, met at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. There, they divided Germany's post-war zones and discussed the reorganization of the world after the war. The Soviet Union pledged to join the war against Japan after Germany's surrender. Starting in January 1945, Soviet air forces began attacking Germany on the Eastern Front. Meanwhile, German forces began their last major offensive against the Allies on the Western Front in February 1945. More than 1 million German troops fought fiercely to defend Berlin, but they ultimately failed. The U.S. Navy continued to approach Japanese territory. Allied forces planned to land on Japan, but the development of atomic bombs changed the situation. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, killing approximately 80,000 people. On August 9th, the United States dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki, killing about 40,000 people. Meanwhile, as agreed with the Allies, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8th, following the conclusion of the war in Europe. The Soviet Union launched an attack on the Kwantung Army, stationed in Manchuria, and captured the island, home to 70,000 Japanese troops, in just 1 week. On August 15th, Japan accepted the unconditional surrender, bringing an end to World War II. The war concluded with the total collapse of the fascist regimes in Germany, Italy, and Japan. The great victory of the Allied powers, led by the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom, strengthened the fight against fascism. The consequences of the war were devastating for humanity. Over 70 countries, with a population of 1.7 billion people, were dragged into the conflict. Approximately 60 million people died, and 90 million people were injured. Many cities, villages, and economic infrastructures were destroyed. The end of the war resulted in significant changes in the world order. The post-war world order was shaped by two major characteristics: communism and socialism, led by the Soviet Union, and capitalism, led by the United States. In the years following the war, countries increasingly aligned with these ideologies. The United Nations was established as a tool to maintain the newly formed international order. Due to tensions over geopolitics and ideological conflicts, the Soviet Union and the United States quickly shifted to confrontation, leading to a new form of conflict, the Cold War.